question of what went wrong, and that's more of a big picture, what went wrong, not just on this rig, but what went wrong in policy leading up to this disaster as well.
With regard to what's gone wrong, I mean, I think that it's at every level, and at the highest level, there is a movement in our country that honestly believes that America's government should be weaker rather than stronger in every instance. And this movement doesn't say that. It doesn't say it's mad at America's government and it's trying to weaken America's government. It says it's mad at the federal government. But the last time I checked, the federal government was America's government. And so we're living at the effect of a successful movement that is opposed to our government being strong enough to protect us from stuff like this. Obviously, America's government needs to be strong enough to protect the American people from threats of this kind, and this movement has won, in large measure, the argument that the federal government is bad and therefore shouldn't have very much power or very much authority. When I worked in my last job, I worked at the Council on Environmental Quality at the White House, which oversees NEPA. And the idea that you would have a categorical exclusion, I mean, NEPA is the backbone for all of our environmental protections. The idea you have a categorical exclusion and just say, which basically means it is just inconceivable and impossible that anything could go wrong environmentally with this project. Why should we put these people through the trouble of having to comply with NEPA, since clearly there is no possibility at all whatsoever that anything could ever go wrong here environmentally. I mean, that's where the federal agency had come down in the last administration. And so I think that we have that should be as shocking as anything that happened afterwards, that level of corruption, that level of disdain, that level of lack of care for the American people, for that region was endemic in that agency. That should be as shocking as anything else, and it's not accidental. The last thing I would just say is that we should be clear that the incentives that were in place to be reckless were pretty high. Just the cap on what you'd have to pay if you messed up was so ridiculously and appallingly low. I think they wound up spending that much money the first day, certainly by the second day. Yeah. And so just that gives you a hint or a sense about where we are with regard to the oil industry, big oil, having its way with the American people and having its way with America's government. So I think that it's going to be important for us as we go forward to make the argument in these terms. We have now case after case after case, whether you're talking about this banking collapse, where we deregulated the banks and they imposed horrible pain on us, but still managed to maintain a bunch of gain for themselves. The same with the oil, and horrible pain, catastrophic pain on us. Still, BP is the fourth most profitable corporation in the world today, right now. So if there's ever an opportunity to begin to make the case for, I don't believe in making the case for regulation. I try to make the case for America's government being strong enough to do its job. This should be one of the great lessons that we come out of this with, in addition to your point about energy policy.
So what happened, and we're still piecing things together, and I have to tell you the news media generally has the facts about 90% wrong most of the time, because this is an industry that's very nuanced, and it has a language that's very different than anything that most people encounter. And so it's very, very hard to think about or to understand what happened without understanding a little bit of the mechanics of how wells are drilled. But all of these wells are drilled with extreme, very high technology, under extreme pressure, in very, very challenging environments. And it takes a very, very careful design to make sure these are safe. Now, the problems that we've seen here in terms of the blowout preventer, you know, the big stack on the ocean floor that we've all been looking at that has had poor maintenance, modifications, and a number of things done to it over the last 10 years since it was built that made it almost unfixable on the ocean floor. Matter of fact, I have a friend who told me that when they videoed the blowout preventer, then they compared it to the Cameron OEM drawings, it didn't match. The blowout preventer was completely modified from the time it had been manufactured with no drawings to document the changes. So when the ROVs went, the remote operated vehicles, went to do what they were going to do to try to shut the BOP, the panel was different. Everything was different. So they're doing everything on the fly. But beyond all that, there are very basic things that you have to do to control these wells. And you have to put in place what are called barriers. And what you have to think of is well control, and then differentiate well control from design barriers. You drill these wells with as many designed barriers as you can, so you don't ever have to get to the point of control. Control is if you're having to control a well, somebody's made a mistake, or you've gone into a strata that no one understood. If you build the right barriers in as you drill these wells, you never get to this particular situation where you have to rely on the blowout preventer. The goal of drilling these wells, especially in the deep water, is you never have to use the blowout preventer. The only time you have to use that is when you're testing. If you're in a situation where you have to use the blowout preventer, especially the blind shears that everybody talks about, the cuts pipe, you've made a huge mistake. And so if you look back at all the steps that were taken over the last year and a half when this well was being designed, there were casing problems in terms of the design. There was poor maintenance and modification on the blowout preventer. There were systems that were disabled or cut off on the drilling rig itself. And the worst problem of all, and this is the problem that we have in the oil and gas business, because the oil and gas business is very macho, is that everybody who's good at this is just a little bit arrogant. And because of that, there's a complacency. And it's just like flying an airplane. You have to pay attention to those gauges, because you have to trust those gauges, because sometimes you get disoriented and you must trust what you're looking at. It's just like that in the oil business. If you don't trust the gauges and the devices you have to control these wells, you will have a problem. And the biggest challenge with these wells is learning how to listen to the language that they speak, because these wells will talk to you. They'll talk to you the whole time you're drilling it. And they talk to you in the way that returns fluid, it builds pressure, it loses fluid, loses pressure, how much friction is on the drill pipe, how it reacts to all the processes that you apply to the well. It talks to you. And looking back at the drilling reports and looking back at all the witness statements, this well was screaming at them for at least 19 hours that it was going to blow out, and they were deaf. They were not listening to the well, and it got away from them, and it got away from them tragically.
Well, I'll take a run at that on two levels. Again, I'm not a technical guy, so I take everything Bob says as God's truth and just move on. So let me talk about, as I said, policy on two levels. One is what used to be called MMS, Minerals Management Service, and as if a name change would make everything better, it's now, I forget the acronym, is something like BOEREM or something. I call it Bummer. I refer to it now as Bummer.
I don't think the marketing department was working on that one very hard.
Yeah, I bet they were, yeah. So anyhow, there was, to say that the culture at MMS was cozy with the oil industry, I think, is to understate substantially what the situation was. There was a lot of interchange of personnel back and forth, and because MMS made money through royalties off the wells, at least my impression was that the culture there was to drill, baby, drill, and get that money coming in. They were proud of how much money they brought into the U.S. Treasury, and if the well's not out there drilling, then that money's not coming in. So there was a very pro-drilling attitude, and when you look at the environmental which I have done, when you look at the environmental documents that were submitted to permit some of these wells, you wonder, I mean, you know, your 5-year-old could do a better job than was done on some of these documents. It just cut and paste, stuff is just slapped together. The press has reported on the Gulf-wide contingency plan that BP submitted to the government. They talk about, saving the walruses and the seals. I mean, animals that don't live there. They had obviously just cut and pasted stuff they had used for a facility up in Alaska and thrown it in there, and nobody paid any attention to it. It just got stamped, and the well got permitted. MMS was also in the habit of exempting many of these projects from NEPA, from federal environmental review at all, through this very unusual process called a categorical exemption, where MMS just said, well, as a group, we're not going to make any of these permits, and these are the permits at the end of the line, the ones that really count, where you're going to do an exploration well, which is what the BP well was, or you're going to do a production well. So you've done the exploration, you've hit pay dirt, and you want to start producing and selling. You go in for different permit for that, and there is zero environmental review according to MMS. We've been working with the government to try to change that, but the process is rather slow, and I'm not sure actually how that's going to come out. On a larger scale, I think the regulatory and legislative failure that we're seeing is, as Bob has referenced, this is a failure to have a rational energy policy. I get most of my news from Jon Stewart on The Daily Show, and he had this segment recently that was just mind-blowing, where he had these clips of every president, I think back to Nixon, saying, we got to get off this oil addiction, we shouldn't be sending this money offshore, and he just had these quotes just backed up, these old videotape, backed up, and every president since Nixon has said that, and nobody's really done anything about it. And as Bob suggested, I think that's why we're in a position where MMS felt incentivized to get as many wells as possible out there and to cut corners on the safety reviews and the environmental reviews, because hey, what's the worst that could happen?